We're beginning a new series this morning, as Kevin announced to us, about the 10 words, called the Decalogue by some scholars, or the 10 Commandments, as we're commonly referring to them. It's really small. I have to turn around and read it. It is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers. Paul in 2 Corinthians. God gives 4 promises to His people in Exodus chapter 6. One I want to highlight, though they're all important. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And here's number 4. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. That word take you there is a pretty interesting turn of phrase in Hebrew. It most commonly means that I'm going to make somebody my spouse. Usually a man will take for himself a wife. You'll see that most often. Interestingly enough, most of our prophets will recognize this, and this moment that the Israelites had with God there on the mountain of Sinai as their moment of being married to God. Listen to the way that Jeremiah talks about this. He says, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness in a land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of His harvest. All who ate of it incurred guilt. Disaster came upon them, declares the Lord. For all intents and purposes, and by all recollections now, as I'm coming into the story of the Exodus, it looks as though God's plan has failed. He'd promised Abraham to have a great nation that descended from him, and all of a sudden, for 400 years now, because Joseph has gone down into the land and invited his family down in there because of a famine, they've stayed down there, and they're being oppressed by the Egyptian empire. And Pharaoh. Pharaoh, he's scared. He's frightened of these people, that they might increase in number so much that they might rise up and revolt against him. And don't be mistaken, 400 years is a long time. The God that they knew has probably started to become forgotten as they're introduced to multiple other gods there in the land of Egypt. They're crying out, though. They're oppressed. Pharaoh makes their job harder. He takes away their straw from the bricks that they're making so that they have to get straw themselves. Pharaoh, who considers himself a god, and all of Egypt considers him a god, he says, you know what, basically I have the power over life and death, and therefore I'm going to make sure that they don't increase in number, and in a terrible act of infanticide begins killing off all of the little baby boys of the Israelite Hebrew people. One mom has a different plan. She takes her little boy when he's too old and is starting to make too much noise and puts him into, well, the word there is an ark. We call it a basket. But she puts him into a little basket ark and sends him down the river. And just like Noah was saved in the water, so is this little baby. And what happens? But Pharaoh's daughter finds this little baby and picks him up, and she says, Moses. I've drawn you up out of the water, and that's what I'm going to call you. And little baby Moses lives in Pharaoh's court and is raised as an Egyptian. He knows all of the things that the Egyptians know. He knows how to navigate the political nature of what's going on inside of Egyptian palaces and such. And life is good, but he also knows who he is. And one day, as he sees one of his fellow Hebrews being hurt by an Egyptian, he takes his rage out on that Egyptian. And for fear of being found out by all, he ends up running into the wilderness. At 40 years old, he starts this new life. I just turned 40 this year. Can't imagine going out into the wilderness just to start a new life right now. And there in that wilderness, he starts a new life that lasts for another 40 years. Until he has a meeting which he nor anybody else who would ever read about it after that would ever forget about. He has a meeting with the true God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. There in that burning bush moment, God says, I've heard the cries of my people. And I'm summing up here, obviously, but it's time. It's time for you to go back and let Pharaoh know to let my people go. And then God does something in that moment that no other God would do. He reveals his name. Because if you reveal your name as a deity, then the people will have power over you. But the statement is, there is no power greater than Yahweh God. Go tell the people that Yahweh God sent you and to let my people go. But God, listen, I've got a stutter, I've got a speech impediment. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do this. Who has power, Moses? Who has authority, Moses? Do you have power? Do you have authority? Or is it God? Are you worried about these other gods? Because guess what? I'm in charge. I'll give you Aaron to go along with you. And Aaron descends into the house of Pharaoh. And there, he sends the message. We know the story of the staff that God has given to him and the power that he has lended to Moses during these times. He throws a staff down to prove that his word is true, and it becomes a snake that consumes the other snakes with people that have done the same sort of miraculous act. And one by one, God, through his hand of Moses, begins to bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. Gods like Osiris. They claimed that his blood veins were actually the Nile River. That gave him the power. That gave him the authority. And as Moses dips his staff into the Nile River, the statement that's made is, who really has the power? Who really has the authority, Egypt? Is it Osiris or is it Yahweh? It becomes very obvious that if you want to talk about blood veins, I'll show you what real blood looks like. One by one, Moses begins to dismantle all of the pantheon of gods that are there in Egypt. Lice, gnats, frogs, and we could talk about all of the specifics, but you can look that up. There's a chart for that online. And don't mistake where we're going with this. It's not just that these were dumb deities. There were spiritual beings that were real, that were more than happy to take worship from people. And the message was, who has the authority? Who has the power? Is it you, Egypt, or is it Yahweh God? Oh, it is Yahweh God. Ra, who causes the sun to rise and to set. Oh, really? As darkness pours over the land. And then he brings judgment onto Pharaoh, who claims that he has power over life and death, as the death of the firstborn sweeps throughout all of the nation, and the only people that are saved are the Israelite people because they've followed the instructions of Moses and Yahweh. Who has the power? You think you're a god, Pharaoh? I'll show you what true power over life and death looks like. But this wasn't just about the people in Egypt understanding that Yahweh had the power over all of the other gods. It was for the Israelites as well to understand that there was only one. There was only one that was ever worthy of worship, and that was Yahweh God, the God who had just revealed himself to Moses by name. Don't forget the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham and Isaac and of Jacob. He has the power. And thus begins the wooing time of Yahweh God and his people as he begins to take them for himself as a bride. He would call them his treasured possession, his special people. Pharaoh, in all of his fear of all of the things that have come about and in mourning of his own losses from child, he sends them away. Get out of here. They flee into the wilderness, and they're confronted with the Red Sea, the chaotic Red Sea. What are we supposed to do with this? Pharaoh somehow changes his mind in all of this, and he starts chasing after the Israelite people. And they're confronted at the Red Sea. They cry out, Moses, have you brought us out into this wilderness to die? Were there not enough graves back there in Egypt for us? We're going to be killed out here. Test number 1. Do you trust him? Do you trust God with your very being? Do you trust this Yahweh God of your ancestors with who you are and your very life? Moses raises his staff over the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts, and they walk through on dry ground. We know this. Pharaoh's army comes, they're crushed by the Red Sea. And there they are in the wilderness, in this wooing time of courting that God has with his people. Will you come to love him, is the question. Will you come to love him as he obviously loves and treasures you? 3 days into that wilderness journey, they're thirsty. They don't have water to drink. Again, have you brought us out here to die? Who do you trust, Israel? Who do you trust? Do you have the ability, Israel, to give yourself water even when it's abundant, is the question. Who do you trust? They come to a little well. Probably 1 million people there out in the wilderness at this time, and it's a tiny little well. Forget the fact that it's a small well and there's 1 million people. They dip the water out and they taste it, and it's bitter water. Mara, they call that place. God does something special. Through the hand of Moses, Moses takes a stick and throws it into the water. It becomes sweet water. And then he leads them to this new Edenic place where there's trees all around and there's wells of water all around, in a beautiful act and gesture of his loving kindness for these people that he's called out of slavery. How he loved them in those days. How he must have just treasured those moments of them learning to trust in who he was, proving that there were no other gods other than Yahweh God. And it's one thing, though, you guys know this, it's one thing to take Israel out of the land of Egypt, and it's a whole different thing to take Egypt out of the hearts of Israel. It's one thing to take David out of the world. It's a whole different thing to take the world out of the heart of David. You catching this? Because there, the next chapter over, they're desiring the sweet meat pots that they had back in Egypt. Who do you trust, Israelites? Who has the power? Who has the authority? To prove it once again, I'm going to send you manna. I'm going to send you quail. There, the next chapter over, they're getting ready to kill Moses because they're thirsty again. And in a gesture almost as though God is saying, I will take the hit on this one. He commands Moses to take that staff that's in his hand and march his way back over to Horeb, where Mount Sinai is, and strike the rock there. And you don't strike the rock of God unless he tells you to. But he does. And water comes gushing out of that rock. And they drink, and they're filled. Who has the power? Who has the authority, Israel? Who is God? Yahweh is God. He brings them to the base of Mount Sinai. And in a stunning spectacle where Moses first met God there on the mountain, God descends upon that mountain in fire and smoke. And the wedding ceremony begins. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. They're preparing for this ceremony. Now, therefore, God speaking here, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. My treasured possession, my segula. In a Jewish marriage, you would have a segula, a treasured possession that you would share as a couple, as a family, something that would represent your relationship. God says, you are my segula. Where I would start to say my vows to you if you were my spouse and we were getting married. In a Jewish wedding, what would happen is they would write a covenant between the two parties. An agreement to who they would be for the other person. There's a ketubah, a covenant that is about to be given. In a Jewish ceremony, there would be a mikvah, a washing of the bride and the groom before they were to present themselves to each other. There in 19, starting in verse 10, the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. The preparations are made. There's about to be a wedding ceremony. And Moses ascends onto the mountain that's there with fire and smoke that's covering the mountain and the people. And God starts to give the instructions. The first of which is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. I am Yahweh God. You shall have no other gods before me. And commandment after commandment he gives them. But Moses is up there for too long and they start to get scared. I won't tread too far into this because Arthur is talking about this tomorrow. But there on the wedding night, Moses comes off the mountain to find that God's treasured people are having an affair. How devastating must that have been? And it's not the only time either. After they enter into the promised land, time after time, they'll give themselves up to Baal, to Asherah. Listen to the way that Jeremiah talks about this, and several other prophets will as well. Do you not see what they are doing in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And they pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. They had committed there in 19. We will follow your instructions. They say it 3 times over and over again. They break that first command to have no other gods before Yahweh God. And you know what? I think sometimes we get down on the Israelites, rightfully so because of their failed tests. They did a lot of good as well. They completed a lot of the tests in a positive way. But rightfully so, I think to myself, yeah, but David, you don't serve other gods. Why are you harking on this so much? Or do I? Do you? Just because I don't bow my head to Baal, or have an idol specifically in my house to a different deity other than Yahweh God, do you not think that there are other spiritual beings out there that get very excited when I give them honor, when I give them glory by my actions, by your actions? Let me introduce you to some of them that might strike a chord with you. Anat. She's gone by many names throughout all of history in different cultures. This was Egypt. She was the goddess of sexuality and desire. Do you think when that's not in check, and under the power and the authority of Yahweh God, that this spiritual being that is represented here by some picture is not excited when I give her or him or it power in my life? Or maybe Ra. Yes, he was the God of the sun rising and setting, but he was also the God of holding back the chaos that was in life. When I struggle, when I think that I have the power, when I think that I have the authority, when I think that I can order things to the best ability of my life and everybody's life around me, I may just be giving honor and homage to a spiritual being that's represented. Anuk, goddess of power. Thoth, god of use, it should say the god of sloth, and misuse of language. Oh, no, that's the next one. This is the god of use and misuse of language. When I don't honor Yahweh God with my speech, when I don't honor you with my speech or those that are around me, do you think that he, she, or it might be excited by that? Totu, the god of laziness. Maybe this one will strike a chord with you. Asclepius, the god of healing. You recognize that symbol? Yeah. Maybe if I put too much emphasis on the fact that medical science has all of the answer for me. Baal, god of many things, but his name means Lord. When I call anybody or anything other than Yahweh God, Lord, maybe he gets excited. Listen, I'm excited about this series, and I want us to take this seriously. Do you have other gods in your life? I want to be the one that stands up. It's like if I'm honest with myself, there are pieces of me that I don't give fully over to God that I want to. I want to say, God, you are the one and the only, the God alone in my life, and I will have no other gods before you. I will love you with all of my heart, soul, and might. Today, will you think about that with me as you consider your actions and the God that you serve?